day, students, and welcome to Unit 2, which is Additional Language and Teaching. Please remember this is for the unit TMN3701, first edition. So this PowerPoint presentation is going to go through the introduction, what CAP says, additional language acquisition. We will then look at acquisition versus language learning. Then we will look at the first language role, the different theories, and then we will lastly look at. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment to think about your own additional language or languages. When and why is it necessary for you to do additional language or languages? Okay. Also think about under what circumstances did you need to use additional language or languages? What are your needs when it comes to using an additional language? And now consider your needs and the situations where you use your additional language, and then decide what the aim of additional language teaching should be. And that is obviously thinking of that aim and thinking of how you are going to be an additional language teacher. Now, what you have thought about is exactly what you need to take into consideration as an additional language teacher. Okay, you need to ensure learners have the opportunity to listen to the language being spoken, have the opportunity to also speak the language, so not only listen to the language. They need to also understand what they are reading without any translation, and write so that they can put their thoughts down on pen. Okay, so these are different things to think about when you are teaching an additional language, when you are providing children with tasks and activities, and when you are giving them materials. Is it on their level? Are they able to read without translating? Are they able to write down certain things on pen and paper without having a struggle in that process? Okay, so in this module, we will learn how to teach children the basics of speaking, reading, listening, and writing. As most learners that are first additional language speakers know very little about the language, okay? Always remember that not all learners can read or write in a language they are able to speak. So a lot of the time, for example, children may be able to speak Zulu, but they don't know the structures or the grammar rules in the language. All right, so what does CAPS say about first additional language? In CAPS, this is defined as a language which is not a mother tongue, but it is used for certain communicative functions in a society. So, for example, the language of learning and teaching in South Africa, majority of schools teach and learn in English, and a lot of learners are not English speakers. Okay, so most learners in the intermediate phase are English first additional language learners, and they will obviously need support and guidance with the language. All right, so we live in a beautiful multilingual society and blessed to have 11 official languages in our country. We also acknowledge 15 other languages that are spoken within our country, but they obviously are not official languages, but they are commonly used. When a child develops and learns two languages at the same time, or simultaneously. This is when a child is known to be bilingual or multilingual, okay? And this is when they are learning or acquiring languages at the same time. So that you can refer to as bilingual language acquisition or multilingual language acquisition. So if you have an example is when two parents speak different languages and the child acquires both languages at the same time. Okay, there are two ways that you can acquire a language. So additive or subtractive. So we go for more the additive. So this is when you have your home language and you're adding on a first additional language. Okay, subtractive is not so favored. So where you have your home language, the first additional language then becomes your home language and therefore subtracts and takes away your home language. So we are looking to add onto the child's language acquisition. So we're not there to replace their home language with English, for example, but rather to add an additional language so that they actually know a language so well, um, like their home language. Before we continue, I want you also to consider the following questions, okay? So I want you to think about your own first additional language journey. How did you learn your home language, your mother tongue? How did you learn your first additional language? Okay, so look at the two differences there and look what's similar. Okay, I want you to compile a list of differences in terms of how you learned your home language and how you learned your additional language. Okay, how old were you when you first began to learn an additional language? Who do you think is best able to learn an additional language, adults or children? Give a reason for your answer. Also, what do you think is the best teaching method when learning an additional language? Okay, I've created a forum folder on under Unit 2 in our module on our module site. So please do give these questions some thought and go add in your answers in the forum. Please also remember that there is no right or wrong answer to this forum. So please, feel comfortable to share your thoughts and your experiences. Right, so now looking at language acquisition and language learning. A lot of the time we look at these two aspects and it can be considered very similar, but they are quite different, okay? So acquisition is the internalization of a linguistic system or language, okay? So this is when you are learning your home language at home. It is an unconscious process and it is informal learning. So when your mom was teaching you a language at home or speaking to you, you automatically, unconsciously developed and acquired this language. Okay? Language learning is more a formal setting. Okay? Here it is a conscious process where children are introduced to new words and grammar rules and so forth. Okay, so when it comes to the school language learning, this is now the formal setting which we will focus on. All right, so in terms of critical language acquisition, there's a critical period. Okay, so Elias Grace wrote a quote from Margaret Atwood. Okay, I don't know how you manage, sir, amongst all the foreigners, you never gabble away like geese, although the children can soon speak well enough. Okay, so this quote kind of refers to that children develop and acquire and learn language easier than adults do. Okay, so it's very debatable. There's no right or wrong thoughts on this. So I also want you to add this into your forum. What do you think the quote refers to? And do you agree that children learn languages easier than adults? Okay, so this theory comes from the innatist theory, where they agree that we are born with an ability to acquire a language. So it's innate, it's built in us. We are born with the ability to. Okay, we are genetically programmed to learn a new language or languages in certain periods in our lives. So this, remember, is for the innatist theory. Okay, so they believe that between the ages of birth and 10 years old, it is easy to acquire language. Thereafter, it's very difficult. Okay, they also say that once the critical period is over, it is not possible to acquire those skills. So it is not possible to easily learn a language. Okay, so this again is debatable because a lot of other theories has come forth and said that it's not only children who are able to learn language. Yes, they may learn language easily, but adults do acquire languages, in a social setting and so forth. Okay? This hypothesis is highly criticized since the theory is not universally accepted. Okay? So there are many theorists that suggest that adults do not acquire a new language easily due to internal and external factors. But they don't take away the fact that adults can acquire a language. It's just not as easier when you are in school. Okay, so they have put down a few points to say why it is easier for children to learn a language. Okay, so children have more time to dedicate to learning. Of course, adults need to go to work, they have responsibilities and so forth. Children are also less pressured, so errors are overlooked. Whereas if we are in a social setting and I speak isiZulu and my isiZulu is not really 100% correct, um, people might laugh at me or, make fun of me and so forth. Whereas when children are trying out a language, there's kind of, less pressure. Children are also praised for small efforts. So, for example, children are taught greetings. They easily are able to practice the greetings. The teacher will then praise them for these small efforts. Okay. They are also introduced to very simple language. So, greetings, farewells, numbers, and so forth. Okay. Children are able to make mistakes. There's also research that shows older children learn languages easier um, than that of younger children. Okay, adults who are exposed to a language long enough can acquire the language without the knowledge of the language rules. Okay, so there are different, thoughts and ideas on this kind of hypothesis of the critical period. Okay. All right, so think about the critical period and see if you agree or disagree. Um, and then we are going to now move on to the role of the first language. When learning a second language, it is important that the child's first language is not neglected. So, a lot of the time, the first language is kind of, um, neglected because a lot of parents suggest that children need to speak English. But realistically, it's important that the child has a good foundation of their first language. And this is why, okay? Children need to have good knowledge and usage of their home language in order to obtain a second language successfully. Okay, so it's important that, you know, um, the development of the first language really, um, becomes strong in order for the children to understand how language works, understand what a language is. So, um, a theorist called Cummins, who came up with the theory we usually refer to as CUP. It is the common underlying proficiency. So this looks at the home language and the first additional language. Okay, so this concept explains the acquisition of a second language and how it is influenced by the home language, the first language. Okay, it suggests that learning a second language depends on the language structures and rules of language um, of the first language. Okay, so we look at the home language here and we see how those structures are then put into the second language. All right, so this image is in your study guide, and you can see that on the left hand side we have the language 1. On the right-hand side, we have the language 2. Okay, in the darker gray, that is highlighting the common underlying proficiencies. So what is common in both languages? And especially in African languages, there are some commonalities between the two languages. Okay, so it's important to highlight that when you are teaching, so that if you are teaching predominantly isiZulu children, you can make connections from isiZulu to English. okay? And you can show them the similarities of the different languages, okay? And that is the degree of transfer, where we take knowledge from the one language and apply it to the other language. So that's very important when teaching first additional language. Okay, so now we will move on to the two theories that we will look at. So it is mainly the cognitive interactionist theory. This has two components, okay? First, it is the interaction, then it is the comprehensible output, okay? So the interaction, as we know it, is having conversations, exposing children to the language, communicating, making meaning. um, so we also refer to it as comprehensible input. Okay, so the input is through interaction, through modified interaction, where you interact with others and you negotiate for meaning. So a lot of the time you are speaking a language that you are not proficient in, you will usually always say to the person, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you get what I'm saying? And that's kind of, you're modifying your interaction, you're negotiating and making sure that the person's receiving the message is understanding what you are saying. Okay? Then the output is when so it's modified output as well when you're immersed in the language, which results in confidence. Children need to talk and produce output, and it is very essential. So a lot of the time as a teacher, we are giving, a lot of the input and children are absorbing the input. But a lot of the time they don't get the chance to produce or to speak or interact in the language. So it's important that, as much as you're teaching the children certain rules, they also need time to practice and produce the output. So those are two important components to think about: the input and the output and the interaction between the two. Okay, so the role of this theory is that language development cannot take place without input, interaction, and output. Okay, so the input is you giving them the information. The interaction is they're interacting with one another, interacting with the teacher, and the output is they're able to produce what they have learned. Okay, interaction should happen continuously in the classroom as well as input and output. This can be encouraged in class discussions, group work, or working in pairs. Right, so how can we teach it? So it's always important to remember that there is no perfect teacher, okay? We've also realized that the traditional way of teaching does not work, where a teacher stands up in front of the class, explains what a verb is, gives out a worksheet, and that's the lesson. So you need to think of ways to make your classroom interactive. Remember, not every lesson needs to end in a worksheet. A lesson can end in a discussion and where children can use the new vocabulary that you've taught them. Okay, so think about how your classroom can be interactive. Okay, as a teacher, it's important to be innovative. So think of different ways where you can teach certain things. It's better than just giving a worksheet to learners. Maybe play them a video, maybe ask them to role play certain things, and so forth. Okay, it's also important to encourage and reward learners for their development. Make sure everything is taught in context. Okay, so that means that something that's relatable to your class. Okay, so if you're introducing weather words, try and focus on the words that we would use in the South African context. So we would not really use snow or sleet, for example, but we would use sunny, rainy, windy, and so forth. Okay, repetition and revision is so important in this instance, so that learners are able to revise and go back on certain concepts. All right, so some questions to think about is, what's the difference between consciously learning a language and language acquisition? What are the implications of the input-output interaction hypothesis for first additional language teaching? What is the difference between language acquisition and language learning? Do you support such a distinction? Justify your answer. What role does does a learner's home language, first language, play in second language acquisition? And what do you regard as the 5 most important current trends of first additional language teaching? So these are some questions to answer in the forum. It is up in Unit 2 on the module site. If you just go into the module site under Unit 2, you will find the forum there. All right, students, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to hear back from you soon.